Have you ever walked into an interview expecting things to go one way, to be routine, and then bam, it takes a turn that you did not expect? Well, that can also happen at a USCIS interview. Maybe the officer asked about your social media, or your wedding playlist, or why your spouse didn't tag you in a photo in 2022. Right? You are not prepared for those questions. You get thrown off, things go off the rails. If that sounds a little too real, this video is for you. I am U.S. Immigration Attorney Lilian Chukwurah, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the U.S. immigration law system. Today we're talking about what happens when your green card interview goes off script and how to handle it like a pro. Let's start with the basics. A typical marriage-based interview is calm, structured, and honestly can be a little boring because the officer has the questions they want to ask you. They have to go through the forms. They have to ask you questions about how you met, where you met, all this stuff, right? The officer will ask you things like your spouse's full name, date of birth, where you met, where you live now, basic questions about your wedding and your shared life. The goal? To confirm that your marriage is real and that your documentation matches your story. And typically, as long as your answers are clear, your paperwork is solid, and you're consistent with your spouse, this part usually goes smoothly. But that's not always how it goes. Sometimes the officer goes rogue, and sometimes the person being interviewed is the one that's going rogue, and the officer has to adjust their questions based on what you're telling them and what their paperwork says. You may now start getting questions about, who sleeps on what side of the bed? When was the last time you saw each other's families? Oh, remember that application you filed 20 years ago? What did you say was the reason that you needed to file for asylum in the US? You're going into this marriage-based interview expecting to answer questions about your spouse. Now they're asking you questions about applications from years ago? You're not prepared for that. You're sitting there thinking, wait, what does this have to do with anything? But here's the thing. USCIS officers are trained to spot fraud. And if something in your file looks off, even something small, or something you said in the interview throws the officer off, even if you may think it's something minor, they may start asking more personal questions, and it may seem random, but they have a reason that they're asking those specific questions. When that starts happening, I need you to do one thing and one thing only. Do not panic, okay? Do not panic. Typically, when these type of questions starts coming up, people start panicking internally, and they start thinking, okay, why is the officer asking me this? Okay, let me give all these other explanations to cover up whatever the officer may be thinking is going on that is not really going on. Stop. Do not panic. Okay? You don't need to give perfect answers. You just need to give a thoughtful and honest answer. If you feel yourself getting panicked, I need you to take a breath. Ask for clarification if the question is vague. So if the officer is asking you a question you don't understand, I need you to stop, breathe, and ask them to clarify because you do not understand what they're asking of you. The second you start answering questions that you don't understand is the second you start giving wrong information. Because how can you answer a question honestly and completely if you don't understand the question to start with? And finally, do not get defensive. That only makes things look worse. The officer may just be asking a question because they see something in your file and maybe you didn't check off a box that corresponds to what they're seeing in your file, and that's why they're asking that question. It does not mean that the officer is thinking about denying your case. It just means they need some clarification. So once you start getting defensive, it's going to trigger in the officer to ask more questions because clearly something may be wrong here. So do not get defensive. That only makes things worse. Now let's talk about the real curveballs, the kind that throws you off your entire rhythm. You go into the office, you're ready for your interview, you are nervous but excited because you know this is it. Once you're done with this interview, you can basically get your green card and move forward with your life. But then the officer is aggressive, the officer is rude, they're short with you, they're very aggressive in their tone, right? Maybe your spouse came with an interpreter, but you understand the language enough to know that the interpreter is not doing a good job. Maybe the officer starts flipping through your file and start asking you for documents that you didn't come with or that you don't think is even necessary for your case. Now the question is, what do you do when those things that is going to make your nervousness, your anxiety go through the roof? What do you do when those things happen? This is where, again, I need you to stay calm. You need to stay respectful, and you do need to advocate for yourself. Okay, when you're in these interviews, you may think, oh, the officer controls everything, but no, sometimes you need to advocate for yourself, especially if you are not going in there with an attorney. Because if you're in there with an attorney, now you have someone on your side that can advocate for you, especially when you can be like, oh, the interpreter is not really doing a good job, or the officer is overly aggressive, and the attorney can just try to calm down the situation, or the officer is asking for irrelevant documents or irrelevant questions that becomes hostile. The attorney can take steps to help calm down the situation. And if that hostility gets to a level that the attorney believes the officer cannot make an objective decision, they can reach out and talk to a supervisor and request another officer. Because again, the whole point of having the attorney with you is to advocate for you. But if you're in there without an attorney, you need to advocate for yourself. If the officer is hostile, you need to stay polite, you need to stay calm, but take your time, okay? When they're, rushing you and being hostile, you want to do things quickly, you want to answer questions quickly because you think you're in a time deadline, but I need you to stay calm. I need you to stay polite, and I need you to take your time in your answers to the officer, because you need to think about what the officer is asking for, what the officer is asking you before you then respond. Make sure, again, that you understand what the officer is asking before you respond. If something is unclear, again, ask them to repeat, ask them rephrase. If there's a word that they use and you do not understand that word, ask them what that word means, okay? Ask them what it means. And if you do not have all the documents, tell them you're happy to provide it as soon as possible, right? If it's a document that you do have and it's just at home, you can let the officer know that you do have this document, you just didn't think to bring it with you. Now, for my clients, when we're going to an interview, there's a whole checklist that we take with us. We take the checklist and make sure that the client comes with those documents to the interview. But there's going to be situations where an officer may ask for something that is from like 20 years ago, from a case 20 years ago, that the client doesn't even have access to at the moment or think was relevant to their case, and that is okay. We can provide those things after the interview. The officer can send a request for evidence after the interview for you to go ahead and send that specific document if the officer needs it. In order to make sure that you do not get thrown off, I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell everyone. You need to know your case better than anyone else. Okay? You do not want any surprises. You need to know your dates, know your timeline, know your documents, and bring them, all of them, to the interview with you. Even if it's a document that wasn't requested in the interview notice, bring it anyway. You'd rather not need it at all than not have it when they ask for it. So I'll give you a quick example of this. When you're filing for citizenship, you're going to have an interview. Typically, you don't need to bring your tax returns if you don't owe any taxes, right? If you have filed your taxes, you do not owe any taxes to the IRS or the state. You typically do not need to bring any tax returns or tax documents with you. However, I always encourage my clients to come with their tax returns just in case you get that one officer that wants to see those tax returns to confirm that you have met your requirements as a green card holder. So again, you may not think it's necessary. It may not strictly say that you need to bring it to the interview, but if it's something that could potentially come up, something that could potentially be needed, bring it to the interview. Okay? Example, in a marriage-based case, you may think you don't need to bring the original birth certificates to the interview because you already uploaded a copy. The officers have a copy of it. I still require my clients to come with the originals because I have had an officer ask for the originals at an interview. And then my thought process is, what if my client didn't have it that day? Then that would have delayed their case. So we always want to make sure that we are going in there with all the documents and not wishing later on that we brought it, okay? And honestly, one of the best ways to stay grounded in a high-stress situation, a high-stress interview, is to have someone in your corner. And in this case, to bring a lawyer with you. Even if they're just there silent in the room, it sends a message to you and to the officer. To you, it sends a message that you have someone in your corner, you have someone that will speak up for you in case that advocacy is required. To the officer, it will give a sense of you are prepared, you are serious, and you know your rights. And there's someone in there taking notes on everything that's happening in case something goes off the rails. So let's say the interview was weird. And I've been in weird fill-in interviews where I have to take so many notes. I've gone to an interview and had like 10 pages of notes just from the questions and the answers, because as an attorney, I cannot answer the questions for you, but I sure as heck can document every single question, every single answer, and make sure that if an officer tries to deny your case and says something happened in the interview that didn't happen, that I have my records right there and can refer to it and see exactly what questions were asked, how you answered the question, and if there were any follow-up questions to that. So if you are in that weird interview, the officer asked some strange questions, you stumbled on a couple of questions, maybe they didn't say much at all when it ended. They just said, oh, okay, we're done for today. We'll send you something in the mail. Now what, right? After the interview, you might get a request for evidence if the officer is looking for specific document or documents, a notice of intent to deny if the officer feels like they have enough there to deny your case, or they may schedule you for a second interview. This is the dreaded Stokes interview, where they will dig into you and your spouse and make decisions based on how you do in that interview. Listen, it happens, okay? But it doesn't mean your case is over. If you get a request for evidence, respond to the request for evidence. If you get a notice of intent to deny your case, your follow-up is key. How you explain any inconsistencies, submitting additional documentation of your relationship, and responding professionally and on time can still save your case. And I stress the on time because a notice of intent to deny has a 30-day window for you to respond. A request for evidence can have up to an 86-day window for you to respond, but the officer can shorten that window. So you need to make sure that you know how long you have to respond. So do not give up. If things felt chaotic in the room, you can still turn it around, either with the request for evidence, the notice of intent to deny, or with that second interview. You still have a shot at turning it around. So do not let the interview stop you from going and planning for the next step. Do not let how chaotic the interview is fully discourage you, because you still have an opportunity to change the officer's mind. If this video helped you feel more confident about your green card interview, give it a like and subscribe for more immigration tips. Still feeling unsure? You don't have to go through this alone. Go to my website, lilylegal.com, click on contact us and schedule your strategy session. And let's make sure you are fully prepared for whatever comes your way. Whether it's doing a mock interview to make sure you're prepared for the actual interview, or you received a request for evidence or notice of intent to deny or a second interview, and you want to know what to do next, how we can help you. Schedule that strategy session. Listen, the interview makes such a huge difference in your process. And if you do not take care to make sure you do well in that interview, it can derail your entire case. You can have all the documentation, but if you mess up at that interview, you could end up being denied. So make sure that you are prepared. Take the interview process seriously. And I hope and pray that you get approved after your interview.